We're going to talk about Africa in the modern period, mostly since 1945, but we're going to go back a little bit further to sort of set up the situation in case you had forgotten. I like this sort of political cartoon that's here. It shows the British on the left and the French on the right, sitting down and cutting up the world, taking their slice, taking their pieces of the world. This is a pretty good way to think about it. Europe, especially in the 19th century, in the 1800s, to some extent in the 1700s, had been carving up the world. And of course, Africa will be no different. Earlier, we talked about how the Europeans had sought a route around Africa because they primarily wanted to get to where they thought the spices were coming from, which was India. And of course, Africa proved to be a much larger continent, piece of land than they had thought. They had been introduced to Africa. Of course, North Africa was familiar to them because it's on the Mediterranean. But slave trade from Africa really started with Muslim slave traders. They were selling slaves to Europeans long before the Europeans went to Africa themselves. But as the Europeans are looking for routes around Africa, it's going to take several years for them to figure out the route to do that. And so along the way, they begin slave trade in the west side of Africa. Muslims had taken their slaves, captured them on the east side of Africa. But for the Europeans, it'll be closer for them to do this on the western side of Africa. So this is in part how that begins, and that we've already explored to some extent, that issue earlier. So we won't go into it much more right now. But there were other goods in Africa, but mostly gold, copper. The contact with Africa, I guess I'd say, is limited until you get to the another 150 years after they start the slave trade. And that's for a variety of reasons. Africa was a very large continent. It was unknown, had dangerous, animals, dangerous diseases, malaria. It had a lot of different people living there who were sometimes hostile. So, all these things kept the Europeans out, and they would trade with Africans along the coast. And that's how it was for quite a while. So, limited contact. So, no colonies, no settlements by Europeans, really. Some of the islands, maybe some of the islands off the coast here, but really leaving the continent alone. Now, it's somewhat ironic that the colonization of Africa actually begins once the slave trade ends, when dealing in slaves becomes increasingly illegal in not only buying and selling slaves, but transporting them for that purpose. The purpose of slavery becomes illegal. This happens in the 19th century increasingly, starting fairly early on with the British. Eventually, other countries will join in as well. So that by the time you get to the 1860s, 1870s, that activity is gone. But by that time, also, we see one of the other reasons was malaria. Malaria will also begin to be somewhat treatable. Quinine had been used in the past, but it really becomes widely used in the late 19th century by Europeans. There had been the knowledge that certain kinds of barks of trees, a certain kind of tree bark, would alleviate some of the symptoms of malaria. That gets worked on, and eventually quinine is derived from tree bark, actually. And then to make it widely accessible, it's placed into tonic waters and bitters, as they were called, too. So you have probably seen something like this, Schweppes tonic water. This contains quinine. And so this could be mixed in with other things, and it helped to alleviate the malaria. So this will also bring this about. There's several factors that bring about what some people call the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. Part of it is, for example, Germany and Italy had sort of been left out of colonialization. This quinine, the ending of the slave trade, things like that. So this will mean then that Africa will go from basically having no colonies, let's say in 1870, to being completely, almost 100% colonized by the time of World War I. We can trace some of this back directly to the West Africa Conference in Berlin, because West Africa was an area that was still open. And here you see a little political cartoon. I believe that's Otto von Bismarck carving up Africa at a dinner table like a cake and handing it out. Basically, they had an agreement here in the later months of 1884 to the beginning months of 1885 where they discussed a lot of these things. That is, European leaders. So we see, like I mentioned, by 1870, 10% has some European control, 10% of Africa. By 1914, you see, some, 44 years later, 90% of Africa is controlled. The only parts that are not controlled, Ethiopia and a portion of Somalia and Liberia. Liberia is an interesting case. There are some states of Africa, especially in West Africa, that are actually purchased, some by Britain, and the British raised money to purchase it to stop the slave trade. And so they actually bought the land and said, now this is British land. You can't do slave trade here. Liberia was a colony, a territory, which the United States purchased and then repatriated Africans who were liberated slaves. That's why it's called Liberia, liberation, to Liberia. The capital of Liberia is called Monrovia, named after Monroe, President Monroe. Well, anyway, it had its independence, and the Europeans didn't come into this area because of that. But other than that, everything else is carved up. Of course, the British have the lion's share of it, especially starting up in Egypt and coming pretty much down the Rift Valley to South Africa. We'll show you a map in a moment. France, about 15%, Germany, 9%, Belgium, 7%, Italy, 1%. These are rough percentages of it. So let me show you a map here just to illustrate this. Here you see Africa on the left in 1880. Some of this up here in North Africa, of course, had been controlled by the Ottoman Empire, and as the Ottoman Empire began to fragment, we do see, for example, Algeria in 1880 is under French control. Tripolitania and Egypt, which is actually more than Egypt, was part of the Ottoman territory, but the British had worked out deals with it, so they had a lot of control there. But a lot of these then were their own kingdoms and territories. Now, the British had some down here in South Africa as well. But for the most part, you see, Africa is not, doesn't have kingdoms, and it's not colonized. It's just rural territory. But take a look over here in 1913. You see the different colors. This sort of salmon color or whatever is British territory. Take a look at that. You've got British territory over here in the west part of Africa. You certainly have it from South Africa almost all the way up to Egypt with very little interruption there. This was part of their plan. They wanted to have sort of follow this route all the way up, and pretty much achieved it. France has got a big section here of West Africa, and we're going to see Spain even gets involved. Italy has Libya, and down here in around the Horn of Africa, and then of course also Germany, this sort of color here. Notice German territories here and here and here. Okay, but the bottom line is, on the eve of World War I, Africa is pretty much chopped up and controlled by the Europeans. Well, what does this colonial European control bring? There are some benefits, admittedly, to this. The Europeans do bring some of their technology. They bring the railroad, the locomotive. They bring engineering of bridges. They bring at this point, the telegraph. So communication and transportation are improved, no doubt about it. It makes it easier to get from place to place, easier to communicate. A postal system comes into play as well. So all of these things, the infrastructure is built by the Europeans. We see also there had been a lot of violence in Africa. There's been a lot of violence there. Tribal warfare is pretty much brought to an end. European law and order is brought into place. The kind of justice system with courts and laws and rulings that people were accustomed to in Europe are brought into Africa as well. There's also improved education, no doubt about that. Schools are built, teachers are brought in, students are trained. Government facilities, government sort of regulations, but also order brings in, and the economic part of it. The economy is built up. Jobs are created, that sort of thing. And we see that some Africans will even go and attend universities in Europe. This will be important during the independence period. But let's say it's a British colony. Some bright students might actually be able to leave Africa, go to Oxford or Cambridge, someplace like that, get an education, and then come back home. Missionaries, of course, are often overlooked in these textbooks and in the discussion. A lot of times all negative stuff about the missionaries is presented. But missionaries do a lot of positive things. They build hospitals, they build schools, they train students. Another thing that they do is, since they want people to be able to read the Bible in their own language, and these languages, many of them in Africa, are not written at all. There's no written language. There's a spoken language. So the missionaries would learn the language first, and then, of course, they had to know the biblical material. I suppose that came first. Then they learn the African language. Then they have to create a way to write it down, a way to symbolize the sounds. And then they began to create dictionaries, grammars, and written languages. So this is going to go a long ways to help in education, communication in Africa, and that's really all pioneered by missionaries. We haven't really mentioned too much about the medical side of it, but hospitals are being built. Europeans come in, a lot of the missionaries are building hospitals. Sanitation practices are improved. The building of sewer lines and that sort of thing. These are all infrastructure ideas that had not been in Africa before, which the Europeans will bring. Many Africans then will be able to get a job, learn a job. There'll be cash crops. They'll actually get cash for the things that they're growing. This had never been the case before the Europeans were there. And of course, they will get involved in operating machines, being involved in industry in that way, and actually getting money for that, cash for that, which they can then use. Now, of course, there are lots of downsides too to the colonial legacy. It'll bring it'll prevent. It's not in the Europeans' interest to have the Africans all be independent and completely autonomous. I mean, that's part of what a colony is all about. It creates for you a market for the goods, that is, for your European. It gives you access to raw materials that you need, and of course, labor, cheap labor. There was oppression of different kinds, discrimination, no doubt about it, racism that was there. Some regions, the economy is not improved, and in fact, it's all the economy centers around, of course, what the Europeans would like to have, and not so much always what is maybe the best thing for the local people. The railroads and roads were built for European trade, and very few go to the interior. Here's a map in the colonial period. It just shows where the train tracks are, the railroads go. You can explore that, just take a look at that. You can see, there's mostly they go into the resources that are needed or wanted and to bring it out to the coast. So this is to transport things along certain routes out to the coast where it could be put on a ship and sail away. But that's the way it is set up. Very few, it's not a network for moving people from place to place as much as it is goods. Now, of course, when profit is made, the profit is being made by the Europeans. Well, they're taking a lot of that with them, taking it back to England, taking it back to France. And of course, don't forget, as anytime you have a government, a system like this, you're going to have to pay taxes. Something we all need to remember. None of this stuff is free. Sometimes people speak of government benefits as if they are free. Well, we're going to get this money. It's free. We're going to get this benefit. It's all free. There's really nothing that's free, if we want to be honest about it. Somebody's going to pay, and the governments don't have money on their own. They get their money from people. They tax them, and they have very creative ways to get those taxes. All right, so that's the Africans are going to be paying for a lot of this stuff themselves, really. We say, well, the British invested this stuff. Well, yeah, they invested, but they're mostly investing the money that they got from the Africans, but they did put some of it back into Africa instead of taking all of it with them. Well, anyway. Of course, the economy is built around being connected to Europe. And so this will be also a legacy of the colony. Well, still, once the Europeans eventually leave, the economy is still set up that way to be dependent upon Europeans. Now, as we approach the 20th century, especially after World War I, we begin to see a push for independence. If you take a look at the map here that's on the right, you can see all of these modern countries which are there today. These are a result of nationalistic movements that were set up in Africa, primarily by Africans who were able to go to Europe, maybe the United States, study in a university, come back and try to bring those ideas to Africa. Somebody like Kenyatta in Kenya. Here's a guy who's trained in the West. He comes back with ideas for independence for Kenya. He's considered to be the father of Kenya, sort of like George Washington of Kenya, to bring this independence movement, the African National Union, he will call it. Most of these, and one thing we see in common, is that most of this is happening after World War I, up until, and then just after World War II. So a lot of this stuff is happening in the 1920s, 1930s, but really a lot of it's happening in the 1950s and 60s, where independence comes. So a lot of these African nations of today can trace their independence back to roughly the 1950s and 60s. So let's say for the past 60 years or so, maybe 70 years. So they're relatively new countries, young countries. And of course, that brings challenges with it. And it's led mostly by those who are educated in the West. But, they're mostly also, if we're being honest, led by people who live in cities, more highly populated areas of Africa, not out in the countryside. Those out in the countryside tend to turn to more, violent, I guess I would say, violent means, terrorism, things like that. For example, the Mau Mau seeking uhuru or freedom will turn to violence. We also see down in South Africa the forming of the African National Congress, or ANC, to try to change things down here and bring an end to apartheid or segregation of Africans from the European populations that have, been in South Africa since the 1700s. But what had developed there, and we'll talk a little more about it later, was apartheid, this separation, and actually developing separate states, almost like reservations that we have in the United States. The people are moved to an area that say, this is your land, you're on your own. Okay. But at times then the ANC can become violent as well. So violence is unfortunately a big part of the history of Africa, especially, let's say, in the past 60 years, violence that is geared towards setting up a country or trying to change what's going on there. So most of these independence movements take place, like I said, in the late 1950s up through the 1960s. Cities are westernized to some extent, but much of the rest of Africa is still very traditional and agrarian for a long time, and still that way really today. So these are all challenges that are there. And the economies are all dependent upon the West, for the most part, to import technology, equipment, to have their economy move with jobs. People want to have, the wealthier people in Africa want to have the things that people have in the West. And of course, to do that, they're going to need the currency of the West to do it. Okay, so it makes it a very, very complicated place, but one that is filled with, unfortunately, a lot of violence and even terrorism. Well, let's take a look at some of the differences and some of the similarities in these political movements. Like I said, most of the African leaders are actually middle class, and they're from cities. So urban, middle class. So by African standards, they would be considered wealthy and city dwellers. They go off to study in Europe, perhaps the United States. They get ideas that their homeland could be free, it could be have an independent state. And of course, in that is that, if I'm wanting this, then it's going to be, I'm going to be in charge. I came up with the idea, I will liberate my people, so to speak, from the Europeans, but then I will be the guy calling the shots because, I've got the education and I came up with the idea. So these people are mostly middle class, mostly Western trained. They know how to speak and read Western languages, like, say, English. And they speak of democracy, although they don't always deliver democracy. They say we're going to make this a democratic state, when in fact, many times it's a kind of autocratic rule, a dictator, that sort of thing. But there comes then to be different approaches in Africa, different approaches to how these African states will be set up. And since a lot of this is happening during the Cold War, it's not surprising that there's a sort of duality to this. On the one hand, many are going to follow a Western capitalist model, a democracy model that has free markets. Others follow a kind of Soviet model, African socialist, communist, that sort of model. These are the two main ways of doing it. Now, the other thing is, of course, there's a lot of boundaries, as you can see here, boundaries of countries. What some people try to argue is we shouldn't have any boundaries. Pre-colonial Africa didn't have these artificially, they would say, created boundaries, so we shouldn't recognize them either. That has not been well received by most. Most people accept these boundaries because they become nationalist. And so these lines on a map become where their countries are. And this is our country, and that's your country, and leave our country alone, that sort of thing. But there is a real push, and it's still there, but I think it's, this dream, I guess, of creating a united, the whole continent united is, well, I don't know if it'll ever happen, but I'll tell you, it's a long ways from happening right now, the Pan-Africanism. But there is an idea that, we could see ourselves as Africans and do things together that way. There has been some compromise for cooperation. The map that you see on the right is from an Organization for African Unity, it was called, the OAU, formed in 1963, and almost every nation of Africa joined it. It disbanded in 2002 and replaced by the African Union, or the AU, which is still in place today. This is an attempt to bring together all these countries in a kind of United Nations of Africa to work together on economic, social problems, peace, and so forth. But Africa has a lot of problems to overcome. These nations in general, one of them is, their economy is built around, a lot of times, one single crop. Like they're raising cocoa beans, right? And that's the biggest part of their economy. Or maybe it'll be gold or diamonds, some natural resource. And that's the entire economy, almost the entire economy. So if something happens to that, if it's coffee, if they're raising coffee and the price of coffee changes, or somebody over in South America begins to grow a lot more coffee, then their whole economy could be in big trouble, because everything's built around sort of one kind of economy. The other thing is, of course, many times those resources are not locally controlled. So the cocoa plantations are actually owned by usually people from the colonial country that used to be in charge of the country. So that is, our economy is built around, let's say, cocoa production, but it's outside European countries that own those plantations and controls that. So that means the economy is still tied back to the colonial power. This is sometimes called neo-colonialism. So that, let's say, the Europeans don't control the country directly, they sort of control it indirectly economically. Still, most countries in Africa, like I said, have to import their technology and their manufactured goods from Europe, from the West. And again, that makes them pretty dependent. And if you take a look at what the governments spend their money on, the money they are making, taxes and so forth, they're putting a lot of it into the military and consumer goods. That is, buying the things of the West they'd like to have, right? Like smartphones and computers, things like that. Spending a lot of money on that kind of thing, but not spending it on infrastructure like improving roads, creating sewer processing plants, and building bridges and things. That is not that much fun, but of course it's necessary. So the other things get taken care of first. There's not much money left for any of that. And of course, across Africa, it's well known that there is an abundance of corruption. This map that I have for you here is just set up and color-coded by the level of corruption. Sort of the darker the color is, if you get over here to the left side, highly corrupt. Over here, very clean, not much corruption. Notice I don't see any color, any countries this color over here. Not really. Most of them tend to be on the corrupt side, and some of them are very corrupt. What do I mean by that? Bribery. So let's say you need to get a permit. I don't know. Governments love you to have permits. A piece of paper that says you have permission to do whatever it is you have to do. Well, how do I get that piece of paper? You got to go down to the courthouse or to a government building, and you've got to wait in line. You've got to go see the person who hands these things out. Well, you would think, okay, I got to go down and do that. So you do it, you wait in line, You go get it, but the guy's not going to give it to you. Why? He wants you to bribe him. He wants you to pay him to do his job. Be kind of like if you went down to get your driver's license, right? And so, that's never that much fun. You got to wait in line. You got to do all these things they want you to do. But then the guy says, well, if you really want your driver's license, you got to give me $100. And you say, no, wait a minute. That's your job is to give me the driver's license. You're already being paid. No, you want this to happen? And then everybody knows you're going to have to pay a guy $50, $100, $20 to get them to do what it is they're already supposed to be doing. That's one level of the corruption, and it goes up from there. That's sort of at the bottom level. But there's corruption all the way up to the top. Obviously, one of the problems, and this was a problem around the world, but certainly here in Africa, the Cold War is on when a lot of these countries are developing. Post-World War II, like we said before, up to about 1990 for 45, 50 years, people had to choose sides. This meant that the Soviets and the United States are going to get involved in your country. If your country or elements in your country are doing things that are considered to be threatening, like forming communist governments or whatever. So that definitely is going to happen. The other challenge, of course, problem in Africa is a tremendous birth rate, population growth. In some cases, even today, it's like twice as high as it is in most of the world. If we take a picture of it in 1980, you would see the population growth in Africa is around 3%. Highest anywhere in the world. I looked it up, and the average in 1980 in the rest of the world is 1.77%. So it's almost double. That means they're having a lot of children, and the population is growing rapidly. That takes a lot of resources. The current world average population, across the world, if you average it, it's 1.1. So it's actually gone down since 1980. But this is a challenge as well. So Africa has many, many challenges before it. I found this, you might be interested in looking at this, but I thought it was interesting. This is a map of the world based upon population. And actually the size of the country gets larger depending on its population. So you notice China and India are the largest countries. Well, they're not really geographically this big, but this is a representation of their population. India has almost tied China at 1.35 billion to 1.41 billion. And of course, those numbers change every minute, every second. But India, it will, I'm sure, in not too many years, surpass China in population, because China has in place severe population control restrictions, where basically the government has been telling people for a long time now, 40 years, 50 years, that legally they can only have one child. So India does not have those restrictions. Take a look over here, the United States, 326 million people, 326 million. So this has the representation of it, and if we look particularly at Africa, notice that Nigeria is overwhelmingly the most populous nation in Africa. Here I tried to zoom in on it. It gets a little bit fuzzy, but you can see Nigeria at almost 200 million people. The United States is at 236 million people. So the other question then will be how these countries will develop. Tanzania is going to go the route of the sort of communist route, socialist route, following a Soviet kind of model. Here we see Nyerere will follow this sort of Marxist approach to things. You can see where the country is located here. You can see him up here. And he brought this Soviet style of Marxism. This is the way some of the countries go. They go kind of following the model of the Soviet Union, sometimes influenced also by China. He formed collectives, village collectives, he would call it. He has links to, of course, communist countries like the Soviet Union, like Fidel Castro. And so there's a lot of talk about it being sort of democratic or for the people, but there's a one-party state. You know, there's no free elections. There's no multi-party system. It's one party. It's a communist approach. He also would jail opponents without even trials. He would call it detaining them, detention. And eventually the economy is bad and the economy fails. And there's widespread poverty in the country. He's also going to be one who says, well, you know, the reason that we had widespread poverty is that our country is divided. We should have all the countries over here in West Africa be one country, or all of Africa be one country. Then we would have a better economy. Okay, so that's one approach. Another approach is to go down the sort of capitalism and democracy, although even there the tendency throughout Africa is to have what we might call dictators or autocratic rulers. The place that has been, at least in the past, sort of the best model in Africa has been South Africa. It's had the best economy. It's had the most success, I guess we would say. And it has the largest economy in Africa. It was run by, settled by Europeans back at about the same time the U.S. was settled by Europeans. So colonial power, way back. So there have been Europeans there for a long, long time who were born there, and they're called Afrikaners. They speak Afrikaans, which is a kind of hybrid Dutch language. And of course, the British have been involved in this area for a long time. Well, as we mentioned before, they had the principles of segregation and apartheid. And of course, this gets focused on, especially in the 1980s, 1990s, and we see movement for change. You have someone like Mandela up here in the upper right, and de Klerk, who was the president of South Africa. So in 1990, President de Klerk releases Nelson Mandela, who had been the leader of the African National Congress for many years. He had been in prison for a long time for his sort of radical ideas, wanting to overthrow the government, that kind of thing. So de Klerk releases him from prison and then says that he will work with Mandela to change things in South Africa. And so in 1993, they both agreed that there would be democratic elections that would be held, and to bring about the end of apartheid and the change of things. Of course, when these elections come, it's pretty clear Mandela is going to win. So de Klerk and Mandela work together to have a transition of power, and Mandela is elected president in 1994. And so this becomes then the model. See what can happen when people work together and so forth. Well, since that time, things haven't gone quite as well. There was a new constitution put in place, but when Mandela steps down in 1999, Thabo Mbeki will become the president. This is a longtime associate of Mandela. He's a fairly conservative politically, and other people wanted things to move in a different way. A lot of people in the African National Congress didn't like some of his plans, and he was forced out in 2008. This guy named Zuma, Jacob Zuma, comes into power, rules for about 10 years. But then there are all kinds of corruption and charges of misconduct, and economic decline is there. And he was finally forced out of office in 2018. So South Africa, while our best sort of best hope or best model, also has some problems. And then, of course, you could go to a country like Nigeria. Nigeria has all kinds of problems, right? It has the largest population in Africa, almost 200 million. It has some money there because there are oil reserves. So this means there's some money to do things. You would think Nigeria could really perhaps thrive under that. But the problem is they've had a succession of strong men as their president, quote unquote, president leaders. First, a lot of military, sort of a military dictatorship. Then they went to a more civilian government, but still we see a lot of problems there. So you see where Nigeria is located, and then you see the size of Nigeria. Basically, if you set it down here over the eastern part of the U.S., from Chicago to Atlanta to New York. So it has quite a bit of territory, and like I said, oil reserves. But it was ruled by Abacha, and he ruled for 5 years. He was a general, military ruler. He died mysteriously and was buried quickly. Why? Well, it is a Muslim country and custom to bury the dead within 24 hours. But he died so rapidly and then was buried. Many people think he was assassinated. He may or may not have been. But this also then brings out the fact that Nigeria is divided. In the north part of the country, it is Muslim. In the southern part of the country, it is Christian. They switched to civilian rule, but still lots of corruption and a lot of tension. And you may have heard about some of this tension because in more recent years, a Christian was elected. I think he comes to power. It's one of the first Christian. I don't know if it's the only Christians ever ruled Nigeria. It probably is for quite a while. He comes to power, and a lot of Muslims are upset. And a lot of violence breaks out in 2010, burning of churches and so forth. And then added to that, a group called Boko Haram is affiliated with Al Qaeda, will come on the scene, and they actually kidnap. They go in and kidnap Christian girls who are out of Christian school, more than one, and kidnap them, take them away, going to convert them to Islam, going to make them brides of Muslim men. Even a couple of students at Southeastern University have experienced this. And they were at a girls' school, and they were kidnapped and put on a truck and jumped off of the truck to escape. So I don't know if you know their story, but this comes right to Southeastern University here where I'm teaching. So we see that it's a divided nation, one with lots of problems. So finally, this guy named Goodluck Jonathan will be replaced in 2015 by a Muslim named Buhari. But the violence still has not ended. There is still, unfortunately, violence. Still, Boko Haram is working within the country as well. So when it comes to Africa in this modern period, many challenges of poverty, of influence still from the outside, of struggling to have viable economies, of violence, of corruption. And so there are many challenges as they face the future.